The first time Daniel Price saw Oldridge Farm, the sun was sinking behind the distant hills, turning the sky a bruised shade of purple that made the empty farmhouse look almost predatory. The locals had warned him not to come after dark. They said the land changed when the light faded, that the fields whispered, and that the house itself remembered every person who had ever stepped inside, especially the children who vanished here 2 centuries earlier. Daniel didn't believe in curses, but the moment he swung open the rusted gate, a cold draft brushed past him like someone rushing out. The house felt awake. He tried to convince himself it was the wind, but there was no breeze. Only a deep, waiting stillness. When Daniel Price first arrived at Oldridge Farm, he felt a strange mix of excitement and unease twisting inside him, a feeling he tried to suppress by focusing on the work ahead. He had spent years digging through archives, manuscripts, and forgotten letters searching for any trace of the Oldridge family, who had vanished entirely in 1783 without leaving a single explanation behind. The farm had been abandoned for generations, left to rot at the edge of a vast woodland where the wind rarely blew and no animals dared to wander. As Daniel approached the property, the dirt road narrowed, the trees arching overhead like skeletal arms closing in around him. His car's tires crackled over dried leaves, and with every passing second, the silence grew heavier, as if the place were holding its breath. When he finally stepped out of the car, the air felt unnaturally still, heavy with humidity despite the cool season. The farmhouse stood crooked against the horizon, flanked by decaying barns and a yard overtaken by weeds. The windows were black and reflective, as if hiding something behind them. Daniel pulled out his notebook, reminding himself why he had come: to document the historical myths, analyze what really happened, and perhaps debunk centuries of exaggerated folklore. He had always believed history was shaped by human choices, not supernatural curses. But standing here, before this house that had frightened entire generations, he couldn't shake the sense that he was trespassing on land that didn't want him. There was a worn sign nailed to the fence, its letters barely visible beneath layers of rot. He could make out just 2 words: keep out. The wood was so old it seemed like it would crumble if he touched it. Beyond the fence lay the cornfield, overgrown and dead, stalks rising like brittle bones. Everything about the place felt frozen in time, suspended in a long-forgotten memory that did not belong to the living. Daniel walked toward the house, each step crunching softly in the quiet. He noticed that the soil near the porch looked recently disturbed, not by animals, but by something that had moved with intention. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When he pushed open the front door, the hinges released a deep groan, as if the house were awakening after a long sleep. A wave of cold air rushed out and brushed against his face, carrying with it a faint scent of damp wood and something metallic. He paused at the threshold, feeling an inexplicable pressure in his chest, the kind that warned him to turn back. But curiosity, ambition, and the thrill of uncovering something lost to time pushed him forward into a darkness that seemed to lean in, watching him with silent, unblinking patience. Daniel had expected dust, decay, and the familiar silence of abandoned places, but what he found inside Oldridge Farm unsettled him to his core. The interior of the house looked untouched for decades, the air stale, the furniture draped in sheets like forgotten corpses, yet something was disturbingly wrong. The dust on the floor wasn't uniform. Near the middle of the hallway, it had been disturbed, swept aside in small, uneven patches that immediately pulled at Daniel's attention. When he crouched down to inspect it, he noticed the marks weren't random. They were shaped, defined. They were footprints, tiny, human footprints that couldn't have been older than a few hours. His breath caught as he traced the shapes with trembling fingers. They belonged to children, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, but their size wasn't what troubled him the most. It was the freshness, the clarity. Dust doesn't lie. Someone had walked here recently, and Daniel had personally unlocked and entered the front door. There was no other vehicle outside, no signs of forced entry, and no nearby neighbors for miles. Yet small feet had walked circles around the room as if pacing, waiting, or searching for something. The prints led down the hallway toward the staircase, stopping only at the first step, where the dust thickened again, untouched. Daniel felt his pulse quickening as he looked up the dark stairwell, the shadows stretching far beyond the reach of daylight. He called out softly, more out of reflex than expectation, his voice cracking slightly as it echoed faintly through the hollow rooms. No answer came, but the silence that followed felt sharper than before, almost tense, as if the house itself had heard him. Something in the atmosphere shifted, a faint tremor in the air like the feeling before a storm breaks. He stood still, straining to listen for the slightest noise, a footstep, a breath, a whisper, but there was nothing besides the slow, rhythmic creaking of the floorboards settling under his weight. Yet even that didn't feel natural. It felt timed, intentional, like an unseen presence mimicking the sound to mask its own movement. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps vandals had snuck in earlier. Maybe some locals were playing a prank on him. But the size of the footprints, the pattern, the absence of adult tracks, and the sheer impossibility of children wandering alone into a place no sane person approached made every logical explanation feel thin and fragile. He reached for his camera, snapping a few pictures, not only to document them, but to convince himself he wasn't imagining things. Still, the more he stared at the prints, the more they unsettled him, because they didn't just show where the children had walked, they showed where they had stopped, turned, and faced the front door, as if watching him long before he ever entered the house as night settled over Oldridge Farm. Daniel tried to distract himself by reviewing his notes and photographs, but the air inside the farmhouse seemed to thicken with every passing minute. He had set up a temporary workstation in the living room, close to the fireplace that hadn't been lit in over a century. The temperature continued to drop, far beyond what he expected from an old, drafty building. He wrapped his jacket tighter around himself, telling his body it was only the cold making him uneasy. But deep down, he felt something else stirring, something he couldn't name. When the last traces of daylight slipped away from the windows and the land outside dissolved into darkness, the quiet inside the house changed. It wasn't simply silent anymore. It was listening. Daniel clicked on his small lantern, its soft glow pushing back only a thin layer of darkness. The house swallowed the light as if it were reluctant to allow illumination. He tried to focus on reading the notes he had gathered earlier, but a faint sound drifted through the ceiling overhead, a soft hum, almost like the distant murmur of voices. He froze, lowering the papers in his hand. At first he thought it might be the wind rubbing against the roof, but the sound grew clearer, sharper. It wasn't the wind. It was speech. The voices were high-pitched, delicate, and numerous enough that he knew instantly they were coming from children. They weren't laughing or crying. They were speaking, whispering, chanting. The tone rose and fell rhythmically, forming patterns that didn't sound like anything he had ever heard before. Daniel strained to make out specific words, but the language was unfamiliar, its cadence unsettling. It had structure, intention, and an eerie musicality that suggested it wasn't random noise. The whispering moved like a tide, swelling, then retreating, as though the children were having a conversation among themselves. Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed at him to leave the house, but he couldn't make himself move. The historian in him wanted to know more, to understand what he was hearing, while the human part of him trembled with dread. As he stepped quietly toward the staircase, the whispering stopped suddenly, cutting off all at once, not fading out. The abrupt silence was worse than the voices themselves. It felt as though the speakers had sensed his approach. Then, just when he reached the bottom step, a single whisper drifted down from the attic, soft and deliberate, spoken in that same haunting, unknown language. It was just one word, but the way it echoed through the house made Daniel feel as though it had been spoken directly into his ear. After the voices fell silent, Daniel forced himself to move again, needing something rational, something physical, something from the past he could hold and examine. The attic felt too close, too alive, so he wandered instead through the lower rooms, pushing open creaking doors and brushing aside cobwebs that clung to him like brittle threads. Every corner of the farmhouse held a faint trace of the family who had lived here centuries ago, but nothing concrete, nothing personal enough to explain what he had been hearing. It wasn't until he reached a small room in the back, one that seemed less disturbed by time, that he noticed a wooden chest tucked beneath a narrow window. Its edges were carved with simple designs, flowers, vines, initials that had worn away, yet the lid remained intact. A rusty padlock hung broken from the latch, as if someone before him had pried it open and then abandoned whatever they found. Inside the chest, beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets, Daniel discovered a leather-bound journal wrapped in twine. The leather was stiff, cracking at the edges, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. He carried it to the lantern's light and opened it carefully, revealing lines of elegant, hurried handwriting written in ink that had turned a deep brown with age. At first, the entries were simple accounts of daily life, the harvest, the weather, the children's lessons. But as Daniel turned the pages, the tone shifted sharply. One entry described a strange illness of the tongue affecting the Oldridge children. Another detailed how they began speaking words their parents did not recognize, words not taught at home nor heard anywhere in the village. The mother wrote of waking to hear the children whispering to each other in the dead of night, forming sentences that made no sense, sentences that chilled her in ways she couldn't explain. The entries grew more frantic as the days progressed. The father described dreams of pale figures standing outside their windows, calling to the children in the same unknown language. The mother wrote of her son staring at the wall for hours, repeating a phrase that didn't belong to any local dialect. They had sought help from the village elders, but none could identify the strange speech. Fear seeped through the pages, growing heavier with each passing entry. Then the journal described the final night. A violent winter storm had surrounded the farm, trapping the family inside. The children moved from room to room, whispering together, repeating a haunting rhythm as though answering someone unseen. The last entry ended abruptly, ink smeared as if written in haste, stating only that the children had stopped speaking English entirely and that their borrowed tongue did not come from this world. Daniel stepped outside the house shortly after reading the final, chilling entry of the journal. The air felt even colder now, almost unnaturally still, as if the entire farm were bracing for something. He needed space to breathe, to clear his mind, to reassure himself that everything he'd read was simply the frightened imagination of a family trapped in isolation centuries ago. But as he walked toward the cornfield, the ground crunching softly beneath his boots, he sensed a presence watching him from somewhere just beyond the reach of the lantern he carried. The cornstalks, though long dead and brittle, rustled faintly despite the windless night. It was not the sound of shifting plants. It was the sound of movement. Small, light, hesitant. Daniel lifted his lantern, and the dim glow illuminated rows of crooked stalks stretching endlessly into darkness. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The field looked as abandoned as it had in daylight. But then his eyes caught a pale flicker between the stalks. A shape, then another. Slowly, like ghosts rising from the earth, several small figures emerged from the shadows. Children. Their skin was so white it almost reflected the lantern light, and their faces seemed expressionless, hollowed, as if carved from wax. They stood silently, spaced out across the front row of the field, all facing him with eerie stillness. What unnerved Daniel more than their sudden appearance was the way their mouths were moving. It wasn't speech. It was motion without sound, like they were whispering words too soft to be carried by air. Their lips formed shapes that looked familiar and foreign at the same time, echoing the strange language he had heard the night before. As he watched, frozen in shock, one child tilted its head slowly to the side, the movement stiff and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by an invisible string. The others followed, tilting their heads in unison, their silent whispering never pausing. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but fear held him in place. There was something deeply wrong with the way the children stood. Their feet were bare despite the cold, their arms hung limply at their sides, and their clothes looked old-fashioned, not from any modern era. He realized with growing horror that their clothing resembled the sketches he had seen in the Oldridge journal. Simple linen shirts, frayed trousers, tattered dresses that belonged to the late 1700s. As he took a slow step back, the children's mouths froze mid-whisper. Their heads straightened at once, their eyes locking onto him with unnatural precision. They did not blink. They did not breathe. They did not move. They only watched him, as if waiting for a signal or for permission to come closer. Daniel backed away from the children in the cornfield, his pulse hammering so violently that he could feel it in his teeth. He forced himself not to turn his back on them, afraid that the moment he did, they would rush toward him or disappear again into the shadows. Only when he reached the porch did he finally dare to look away. Fumbling for the recorder, he kept clipped to his jacket. His hands shook so badly that he almost dropped it. He replayed the audio he had captured inside the house, desperate to find something, anything, that would help him understand what he was facing. The recording crackled with static at first, but then the whispering voices filled the speaker, clear and layered, forming a pattern he hadn't noticed earlier. The words sounded sharp and rhythmic, every syllable deliberate, almost ceremonial. It no longer sounded like frightened children. It sounded like chanting. Daniel listened closely, replaying the same section over and over, each time feeling a fresh wave of dread as he began to recognize something disturbingly structured in the sounds. It wasn't just random noise. It wasn't gibberish. It was language, but not one he could identify. And the more he listened, the colder his skin became, because something about the cadence stirred a faint memory in his mind, something he had read years ago during his research into early settlement rituals. A nearly forgotten dialect used by a fringe cult that once lived in the Oldridge region long before the farmhouse was built. They had been driven out by neighboring villages for practicing rituals described as unnatural summoning. The dialect had supposedly died with them. No written examples had survived. Scholars only knew fragments, and even those were disputed. Yet here, on his recorder, children were speaking it fluently. The realization felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. How could children from the 1700s have known a dialect that even historians couldn't fully reconstruct? And why were they using it now, centuries after their disappearance? A cold certainty tightened in his gut as he remembered the Oldridge journal. The parents had described the children speaking a borrowed tongue, one they believed did not come from Earth. Daniel had dismissed that as superstition when he read it, but now, hearing the chant echo through his recorder, he felt the weight of their terror. This wasn't a language children discovered on their own. Someone, or something, had taught it to them. He lifted his eyes from the recorder and stared out into the dark field. The pale figures were still there, still motionless, still watching the house. And as the windless night pressed against the wooden walls around him, Daniel felt an unnerving truth settle deep into his bones. The forgotten tongue had not died out. It had been waiting here, preserved by the land itself, whispered through generations of silence, waiting for someone to hear it again. Daniel stepped back into the house, hoping that the heavy wooden walls might offer some sense of protection. But the moment he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted again. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before lightning strikes. He kept the recorder in his hand, its faint glow trembling with the unsteadiness of his grip. The whispering had stopped for now, but the silence that replaced it felt worse, as if the house itself were holding its breath and waiting for him to make the next move. Daniel moved cautiously toward the center of the living room, trying to convince himself that he was still in control of the situation, that logic could still guide him through whatever nightmare he had walked into. But as he lifted his lantern and scanned the corners of the room, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Something small, something fast. He turned sharply, but nothing was there. His breath echoed loudly in his ears. When he turned back, his entire body went rigid. In the reflection of the dusty window, he saw a small figure standing behind him. A child. Thin, pale, silent. Daniel spun around, chest tightening, and the figure vanished instantly, leaving only the dim glow of his lantern flickering across the empty room. He stumbled back a step, gripping the lantern tighter, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. But before he could think, another movement caught his attention, this time to his left. He turned again and saw a small hand gripping the doorway, tiny fingers curling around the wood. A second later, another hand appeared on the opposite side of the same doorway, as if two children were peeking in. But when he moved closer, the hands withdrew into the shadows so quickly it was as though they had been yanked away by invisible strings. Daniel's breathing grew shallow as he backed into the center of the room, trying to keep every angle in sight. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. His shadow on the floor began to stretch unnaturally, pulled forward like a long, dark ribbon reaching toward the staircase. And as he watched in numb horror, a second shadow joined it, small, childlike, with thin legs and a narrow torso. Then another, and another. They were forming around him, circling him, gathering silently as if studying him. He turned slowly in place, lantern trembling, and realized the children weren't just appearing randomly. They were copying him. Every time he moved, whether he lifted his arm, turned his head, or stepped back, the pale silhouettes around the room mimicked his motions with perfect precision, but their timing was off by a second, like echoes that were learning how to be real, driven by a mix of terror and curiosity. Daniel moved toward the barn behind the farmhouse, the cold night air gnawing at his skin. The structure loomed like a jagged shadow against the sky, its wood rotted and blackened from decades of exposure. As he stepped inside, the smell of smoke and damp earth hit him instantly, the remnants of long-extinguished fires clinging stubbornly to the air. His lantern's light trembled across the walls, revealing splintered beams and broken tools. But it was the floor that held his attention. Burn marks etched into the wooden planks formed a pattern, a perfect circle with intricate symbols etched along its edges, symbols that twisted and curled like serpents frozen in ritualistic form. The circle seemed too deliberate to be a coincidence. Daniel's stomach churned as he realized this was not just a random remnant of farm life. Someone had designed this floor with intent. Kneeling closer, he traced the burned lines with a trembling hand, noting the faint residue of ash and what looked like scorched powder embedded into the wood. The circle was clearly a space meant for people to stand, their positions dictated by the markings, their movements choreographed by an ancient design. He recalled fragments from the journal he had found earlier, passages where the Oldridge parents described nightly rituals in the barn, candles forming a ring, children moving in patterns, whispering words no outsider could understand. At the time, Daniel had thought them paranoid, imagining threats in the shadows. Now, standing above the same circle centuries later, he felt the weight of their fear pressing against his chest. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the barn, resonating from the floor itself. Daniel froze, realizing that the circle was not merely symbolic, it was functional. Daniel stepped back, tripping over a loose plank, and his lantern wobbled dangerously. His eyes darted across the circle again, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined the pale figures appearing, gathering into the burnt ring, moving in rhythm with the ancient chant. A cold certainty gripped him. This circle was not just a relic. It was an invitation, and whoever or whatever had designed it had left instructions for the centuries to follow. Daniel's hands were trembling as he stepped out of the barn and back toward the farmhouse, the chill of the night pressing into his bones. His mind was racing, struggling to piece together what he had just witnessed in the ritual circle, and yet a deeper, more primal fear gnawed at him. He sensed movement around him before he saw it. Shadows flitted between the trees at the edge of the field, pale shapes that seemed to emerge from nowhere, thin arms reaching outward. The children from the cornfield had returned, moving silently, encircling him with an unnatural patience. He froze, unsure whether to run or confront what was unfolding, and in that instant, the whispers began again. This time, the children did not speak to one another. Their voices turned toward him, low, melodic, vibrating through the night air. Cold fingers brushed against his cheeks and shoulders before he could react, their touch lighter than air, yet heavier than any weight he had felt before. The whispers became words, forming sentences in the lost language he had heard before. Daniel's pulse quickened as he realized, with a growing dread, that he understood the words. The ancient tongue was no longer foreign to him. Each syllable carved itself into his mind with terrifying clarity, the meaning undeniable. They were welcoming him, calling him into their world, instructing him, binding him. His limbs felt numb, but he could not resist the pull. The children pressed closer, their eyes unblinking, faces pale and expressionless. Daniel felt a cold rush flooding through him, a sensation that was neither fully fear nor fully warmth. It was as though the children were reaching inside him, mapping his thoughts, learning his memories, claiming parts of him he had always believed were private. As the whispering grew louder, more insistent, he realized the language was doing something impossible. It was reshaping his perception of the world, aligning his mind with theirs, threading centuries of knowledge and secrets into his consciousness. Daniel stumbled backward, trying to maintain control, but the children mirrored every movement, perfectly and instantly. Their synchronization, previously unsettling, now felt intentional, a precise choreography designed to teach, to convert, to claim. Every gesture, Every whisper, every glance held power he could not resist. And as the night deepened around him, a dreadful realization gripped his heart. The children had never been ordinary, and the land had never forgotten them. Their patience had lasted 200 years, and now it had ended, drawing him into the fold, marking him in ways no one could undo. Daniel felt the pull of the children's presence stronger than ever as he stumbled toward the farmhouse, each step heavy with dread. Their whispers wrapped around him, curling into his thoughts, pressing against his memory, shaping the very way he perceived the world. The shadows that had once been distant, insubstantial, now clung to him, bending the dim light of his lantern into strange, shifting shapes. He realized with a sinking certainty that the children had never truly been missing. The land had kept them, preserved them in the silence of decades, holding them in a state between life and something far older, far stranger. The windless air, the frozen fields, the crumbling farmhouse, they were all part of a web, an enclosure crafted to ensure the children remained untouched by time, waiting for someone to witness, someone to enter their domain. As he moved through the hallway, Daniel's eyes fell upon the familiar footprints that had first drawn him into the house. They were no longer simple impressions in dust. They glimmered faintly, what as if alive, winding through the rooms in patterns he had never noticed before. Each step felt deliberate, calculated, like a path meant for him to follow, guiding him deeper into the heart of Oldridge Farm. The whispers intensified, not chaotic now, but synchronized, almost patient, each word enunciated with care, teaching him, warning him, seducing him. He realized the children were not just echoes of the past. They were custodians of a knowledge older than the farmhouse, older than the land itself. Daniel's mind struggled to comprehend what was happening as he felt their hands brush against his arms, shoulders, even his face. The coldness of their touch was overwhelming, yet there was a strange clarity that came with it, as if the sensation unlocked something deep inside him, a connection to a world he had never known but had always been part of. He began to understand fragments of their language fully now, words that described the farm, the fields, the barn, and the circle he had discovered earlier. They spoke of continuity, preservation, and purpose. The children's voices wove together, forming a narrative that spanned centuries, teaching him that they had never been lost, only waiting for the right person to join their rhythm. A sudden realization slammed into him. The land had chosen him. The farmhouse, the barn, the ritual circle, the children, all of it had existed to prepare him, to mark him, to make him part of what had been preserved for 200 years. As he stood frozen, listening to the whispers that now carried authority and insistence, he understood the terrifying truth. The children had survived, and in doing so, they had claimed the land entirely, holding a place outside time, a world hidden from the living. And now, they were reaching for him, calling him to belong.